I'm going to be presenting this week by video lecture, sort of asynchronously, the material around human biology that we have time to cover, which will include a basic introduction in this video lecture, and then human digestion by way of video lecture as well, and then human immunity in person when we meet on December 7th. So let me dive right in. I want to try to be as concise as possible. We're focused on an introduction to human systems, which will include a little bit of introduction to animals in general. Animals are multicellular, and so are plants, and so are fungi, the other major groups of eukaryotes. But animals have achieved evolutionarily a greater variety than either of the other groups. And it doesn't mean animals are better or more highly evolved or more biologically successful. It just means that the variety of cell, tissue, and organ types that have evolved in animals have allowed for a greater distribution in terms of where animals live and how they live and how they achieve those basic biological life activities that we defined in our very first day together. So, complexity is an interesting challenge because if you're a single cell, like the amoeba you see here, the exchange of materials that you need or don't need, want to get rid of, is relatively straightforward. All of that exchange happens by way of a cell membrane. And that cell membrane is complex and capable of mediating or controlling a lot of very detailed processes. But once you become multicellular, you have to come up with a way to allow every single cell in the organism to get access to nutrients, to get access to oxygen for cellular respiration, and to be able to get rid of the wastes that can become toxic if they build up. So what's evolved in animals are structures that allow for the exchange of those materials throughout various parts of the body. And so we're going to see that with digestion, for example, that you need a number of organs and structures to allow for the exchange, for the breakdown and exchange of nutrients, as well as for the elimination of wastes. And that's a major theme that we'll see as we move through human systems. Multiple cell layers are one strategy, right? If you want to move to a multiple cellular structure, a multiple cellular organism, you probably want to have as many cells exposed at some point in some way as possible. And you might think, well, there isn't much exposed in the human body. But if you think about it, there really is. There's not only the external of the body, our skin, but there's also our digestive tract, which in a sense is exposed entirely to the outside world. If you look here at the top of this diagram where food comes in, and at the bottom of the diagram where wastes are expelled, this tube is really open to the outside world. It's very different from the outside world, right? But if you think about it, that tube is exposed and allows for an exchange with the outside world, which putting food into our body initiates. Even our circulatory system is a kind of exposure, right? Capillaries are designed to make their way into proximity with almost every cell in the body. And so that's exposure, right? The lungs are exposed to the circulatory system and therefore to the outside world. So, in a way, all of the various systems you see in animals and in humans in particular, since that's our focus, are really ways of exposing cells to materials or to spaces that allow for an exchange. These exchanges are hugely important, right? Oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients and waste. Every single cell of the body is participating in some level with those exchanges. And so you can think of an animal's body, a human body, as a very organized and strategically structured body that allows for these exchanges. So this is not truly what an animal that we know of looks like. This is just a model showing the various ways in which circulation and the urinary system and the digestive system all work together to create exposure for exchange of materials. And of course, that brings us back to the idea of homeostasis. Homeostasis is the process of maintaining a particular condition within cells, within the body. Even regions of the digestive system, as we'll see, will vary one from another. And so there is a process of maintaining conditions that are ideal for cellular functioning, for life functioning. And we're very used to thinking about the process of temperature regulation, for example, thermoregulation. And we have seen this slide before, wherein there's a set point, a desired temperature within a room. If the temperature in the room goes up, if that temperature is exceeded, then there is a processing unit, right? The thermostat, which is capable of sensing that temperature change and to then control a modification or a change in the room. It turns the heat off, right? It might also turn the air conditioning on. So there is a change that causes a response. That response brings the temperature, in this case, back down to the set point. And those changes can take place whether the temperature increases or decreases. So we call this a negative feedback loop. This is a loop by which an increase will cause a decrease. That's the negative part, means sort of the opposite direction. Or a decrease in temperature will therefore cause an increase. That's a negative feedback loop. And it is the sort of process that goes on within the body all the time, whether it's controlling sugar levels in the blood or hormonal levels during a menstrual cycle, or controlling the perception or the sense of hunger in the body when we're hungry or when we're satiated or full, right? All of these are ways that the body maintains a particular or desired level or condition. And so here's the example of thermoregulation. You can see the specific changes that take place when the temperature increases. Blood vessels dilate or increase in diameter. Sweat is produced. These are all changes that will facilitate rapid cooling by evaporation at the surface of the body. Then the body temperature drops and we're back to the set point. That's all good. But if the body temperature decreases, then we experience shivering and our metabolism increases in order to generate heat. The blood vessels constrict, they draw into the body in order to minimize heat loss at the surface of the body. So homeostasis is hugely important and one of the major themes we'll see when we look at human systems. So keep your eyes open for this idea of maintaining conditions that are desirable, that allow for survival, that allow humans and other organisms to thrive. Another theme is levels of organization, right? So we need to keep in mind all these various levels of organization when we think about the human body, human functioning, human thriving. We know of cells, of course. Cells build tissues. Tissues would be a collection of cells that are all one type, that all serve one function generally. Organs are built from tissues, multiple tissues. So an organ performs a particular function, but might need multiple tissues in order to accomplish that function. organs can be built into organ systems. For example, the circulatory system or the muscular system. So you can see here, we start with atoms and molecules. We build cell parts. We then build cells. Cells are organized into tissues, tissues into organs, organs into organ systems, and eventually you get the entire organism. And along the way, as we've said multiple times this semester, you get characteristics and capabilities that weren't possible before you built the next level, before the next level was possible or present. So, for example, a human body made of multiple organ systems, all of which work in coordination, is capable of so much more than the circulatory system by itself, which is capable of so much more than the heart, an important part of the system, but still not capable of everything that the system as a whole can accomplish. And the heart can accomplish what cardiac muscle or other muscle tissue types cannot on their own. All muscle cells can do is shorten. And take a lot of shortening muscle cells and organize them into tissues, then those tissues into a heart. Now the heart can direct blood to very specific places and so on. So this idea of emergent properties where you can achieve far more with the larger structures, the more complex organization than you can with the simpler parts. So a human at the gym is certainly accomplishing a whole lot more than any of the individual parts that make up that person. So that's a theme that I wanted to revisit. Another theme, structure and function. And I know Megan talked about this when looking at the microscope, that each of the parts of the microscope, the structures present on the microscope, have a particular function, and you can kind of tell what those functions are based on where the parts are located and what they're made out of and how they're arranged. So the same is true for living organisms. The various cells represented here, for example, nerve cells or bone cells or muscle cells or any other cells that are involved with flight or hunting, even more complex hunting behavior that involves flight, but also a number of senses in an owl. They are all explainable. They are all intimately tied to the various structures that are present. So wings, for example, have a particular structure that allows for flight. The eye has a particular structure that allows for interpreting light and knowing prey from its surroundings. The various cells involved with secreting and maintaining bone have a particular function for supporting the wing and making talons possible and so on. So you get the idea that everything that a living organism is capable of, all the way down to the cellular level, is explainable in large part through the theme or sort of the lens, the way of thinking that we call structure and function, matching what something looks like and where it's located to what it's capable of doing and what it makes possible. So we call all the things that happen, things is a weak word, but we call all of the capabilities, the various traits that an organism like an owl possesses. We call them adaptations. They're evolved traits or characters that make it possible for the owl to thrive where and how it does. Adaptations are present throughout every single feature that we're going to discuss in human biology. So we're going to do a quick overview of 4 primary tissue types. If you look at all the various tissues, and again, a tissue would be a collection of one type of cell that all perform the same function. And there are 4 general tissue types. The first of those is epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues tend to be at the surface of an organ or structure. And that can be internally as well. So there are epithelial tissues involved with the skin, the formation and maintenance of skin. That's an obvious surface feature, but also the inside lining of our digestive tract or the inside surface of our lungs and the various ways in which tissues are organized there. So epithelial tissues are surface tissues. Epi means above or on top of, and you can see all the places in this diagram and in the text where epithelial tissues are found. Hugely important tissues because they mediate some of the exchange that we mentioned previously as being so important, the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients and wastes. They also protect anything that's at the surface of a structure is going to be involved with protection. The next general type of tissue that we find in animals and in humans in particular, our focus are connective tissues. So some of these are very obvious tissues that connect muscle to bone, for example. We call them tendons. Tissues that connect bones to bones and allow the skeleton to hold together. Those we call ligaments, and they're very obviously connective tissues. What aren't so obviously connective tissues are tissues like bone and blood. And these tissues, what they all seem to have in common is that they are living cells that secrete and function within some kind of non-cellular matrix or surrounding material. So blood, for example, blood cells are bathed in plasma, and bone cells are surrounded by non-living, non-cellular components that the cells themselves have secreted and helped to build and help to maintain, but they're non-cellular in nature. So what connective tissues have in common, even though there's this huge variety of them you can see here, including adipose tissue, that's fat tissue, the storage of energy, and all the various functions you see here. Obviously, a lot of important functions for connective tissues, but what they hold in common is that they're cellular in nature, but the cells are usually surrounded by a non-cellular matrix or material of some sort. Muscle tissues, pretty self-explanatory, but they show up in places we might not often think of them. The heart, for example, is composed of muscle tissue along with some others. There are skeletal muscles, which are those involved with basically movement. So think of dance or exercise or walking, the kind of movement that is generally voluntary, even though you don't have to always consciously think about it. Your brain is controlling what muscles can contract and when. And then there's also some what we call smooth muscle. And smooth muscle is generally found in parts of the body where involuntary muscle contraction is needed, so largely through the digestive tract. As we'll see when we look at digestion, smooth muscles are hugely important for keeping food, the digesting food, moving. And if that food were to stop moving, which it can under some circumstances, some very serious health consequences can take place. So lots of important functions for muscle tissue. That's the third tissue type. The fourth tissue type is nervous tissues, nervous tissues. So obviously the brain is composed of nervous tissues, but also the various nerve pathways in the body. So nervous tissues are involved with sensory functions, knowing what the conditions in the outside world are like, detecting energy like light and sound, detecting chemical signals like taste and smell, and being able to gather information about the surrounding world, but also to respond to and integrate and make sense of that information. Nerve tissues and nervous tissues are also, of course, involved with a whole lot of communication that we're never aware of. Communication between the blood and the brain and eventually, let's say, the heart during exercise to increase heart rate, as we did in our very first lab together. that response wasn't something that you had to consciously control, and the nervous system is obviously directly involved with that communication and making that sort of adaptation and response possible. All right, so when we bring all of the tissue types together, we can begin to create organs. So you can see here, this is a section of the small intestine. And you can see up here at the surface the portion of the small intestine that would be in contact with the digesting food. You can see these sort of pillar-like structures, and they are topped with epithelial tissues that are going to moderate the exchange of nutrients. There's connective tissue that in the form of blood, and also material that anchors the tissue, the lining of the small intestine, to the muscle tissue below, the muscle tissue which is involved with constriction of the digestive tract and keeping food moving through that digestive tract. More epithelial and connective tissues below, anchoring all of this at the outside surface of the small intestine. So lots going on within an organ, right? This would be the small intestine would be the specific organ, but you can see a number of tissue types are really crucially important here. And of course, we have pain receptors there that would be considered part of the nervous system. So if you have a stomach ache, if you get a food poisoning, for example, we would say a stomach ache, but also just bowel discomfort in your small intestines, just beyond the stomach, that's all going to be mediated by the nervous system. So there's this sort of coordination of all tissue types. All right, so we're going to finish with just a quick overview of all the major systems. All we need to know here are the general functioning of each of these systems, and not details except for the two that we cover in detail separately: digestion and immunity. So let's just jump in. Human organ systems. The skeletal system, hugely important for support and for movement. It works together with the muscular system to create movement. Bones can't move on their own, but skeletal muscles are anchored to bones, and it's that anchoring and support that makes movement and coordinated movement possible. Also, in the bones, we store calcium and other minerals, and a very crucial, important role is in some parts of the skeleton, namely in the longer bones like the femur and the humerus and the upper arm and upper leg. These are bones in which blood cells form. Really interesting that blood cells form in the bones, but it's one of the functions that bone serves in the body, and it's hugely important. So there are the key functions of the skeletal system. The integumentary system, that is basically our skin. And so there's a protective role here, obviously. The integumentary system also includes hair and nails, which are derived from tissues in the skin. So there's a lot going on in terms of protection, right? Nails are predominantly about protection, and they play other roles in, cultural roles and so on. But the idea of protection is central to the integumentary system. So no need to know all of the details of what's involved with the top layers of skin, but it's very complex. There's a lot going on. And of course, the sensory function is important. And one I don't have here, but is also important in most animals, is thermoregulation. So being able to moderate temperature up or down because of functioning in the skin. So we've mentioned sweat for helping to cool the body by evaporation from the surface. But also, when we're cold, what we call goosebumps, or in some language, some translations, it's chicken skin, right? If you've ever seen or thought about looking at chicken skin up close, it's really the hairs on the surface of the skin. There's a little muscle that can pull back on the hair and helps to create a little warming layer of air right against the skin, a little layer of insulation. Um, Now, it's not hugely functional in humans, but in animals with fur, more hair on the body, that's an important part of thermoregulation. So you can actually you can basically kind of fluff the hairs on an animal, and air will be more easily trapped and warmed at the surface of the skin to provide a little insulation. So it's sort of an evolutionary remnant in humans. Goosebumps don't really help to warm humans. I don't know of anyone who's hairy enough really for that for that to work. But at any rate, there's a lot going on with the integumentary system as well. Muscular system, movement and support, moving through food through the digestive tract, keeping the heart beating. So any place you need movement, muscles are involved. So we'll keep that one that simple. Circulatory system, we want to transport nutrients and wastes throughout the body. Every single cell, again, needs access to nutrients and needs to get rid of waste. Every single cell needs access to oxygen and needs to get rid of carbon dioxide. And thermoregulation is another really important function here. As we mentioned, the blood vessels dilate when we're warm, and you'll see veins at the surface of your skin trying to expose that warm blood to the evaporative cooling at the skin's surface, or constricting and drawing into the body when we're cold in order to preserve heat. So movement of nutrients and wastes, oxygen and carbon dioxide transport, and thermoregulation for the circulatory system. As we'll see, there is a really important uh, immunological function in the blood as well, but that's focused on a separate system that we'll mention here shortly. The respiratory system is about exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. Also helps with water regulation a little bit. So if you can breathe on a mirror or on a window and it will fog up. Well, that's all moisture that is leaving your body. And the respiratory system helps to regulate the amount of moisture that is retained or lost when we breathe. And the obvious gas exchange in the lungs is only part of the story. There's also this function of helping to control the amount of moisture in the body as well. Really important for animals that I'm thinking specifically of elephant seals, for example, that haul out onto the beach during certain parts of the year, and the females give birth and then nurse the young, and they never eat or drink at all during that time. They are entirely devoted to nursing and caring for the young. And in that time, because they're not drinking, they have to have adaptations for minimizing the loss of moisture that we see when we breathe on a mirror or a cool window and see that condensation. So the respiratory system, going back to that again in terms of the nasal cavity and how it's structured, and the lungs themselves and how they're structured, what happens to air as it passes from outside the body into the body and then back out again. Those are all important functions of the respiratory system. The digestive system is for the breakdown and absorption of nutrients and for the elimination of waste. So we're going to see a lot of structures that are designed to maximize the efficiency of that process. And we'll see that in more detail later this week. The urinary system is for the elimination of wastes and for water balance. So metabolic wastes, the stuff that are produced and present in the blood. So these are coming from the blood. The kidneys and filter the blood essentially and prepare waste to be eliminated along with water as urine in the bladder. So we also use the kidneys to maintain the balance of sugars and salts and a number of other solutes, right? Going back to that term, the stuff that's dissolved in the blood and in the cytoplasm of our cells, it's all needed. And that homeostasis, that homeostatic control of those various materials that are dissolved in the blood is maintained in the urinary system as well. The endocrine system, this is basically our hormones. I think it's worth seeing, even though we're not going to look in detail at the various structures that play a role with this system. There is no obvious connection between all of these organs you see, from the hypothalamus all the way down to the testes and ovaries, but they are in communication with each other. They coordinate their functioning through chemical signals that are carried in the blood. So the blood is the connection for the endocrine system. Hormones that are produced in one part of the body are released into the blood and have an effect in another part of the body, which might be to make more hormones, which then travel through the blood to another part of the body, which may then make yet more hormones. And there's a lot of homeostasis going on here. There's a lot of regulation of internal conditions. And hormones are involved with just about every major life function you can imagine, from digestion to reproduction, just to name the two biggies, right? So there's a lot going on here with digestion and with reproductive preparation and signaling and response. And we think of hormones as being little messengers released by one glandular tissue, one part of the body, and having an effect in another. That's the endocrine system. The nervous system, we've mentioned nervous tissue, but of course sensory input, coordinating the response to that input, being able to control the internal conditions in the body, especially the brain is involved with that. But if the brain doesn't have functioning nerves, then the signals can't be received or sent. So everything from thinking to feeling to sensing to responding to moving to digesting to our moods, it's all possible because of the nervous system. So hugely important, hugely important. The mention here in the last bullet point of circadian rhythms, that's our biological clock. So we're learning more and more all the time about the brain and how it functions in maintaining some sort of regular pattern of sleep and rest, and how important that is for the brain functioning. And so a lot of complex life functions happen here, are focused here, centered here. You could take an entire course on the nervous system, neurobiology. You could major in neurobiology, neurophysiology. There's so much complexity and so much going on and so much still to learn. So really fascinating stuff. I keep saying of all of these systems, so many important functions. So I think you probably get the idea that all of these systems have to function. And if you look at the nature of disease in a very general sense, ultimately disease has a cellular cause. Ultimately, disease is going to be happening on a cellular level. And that malfunctioning within cells is going to play out on a systemic level, right? So you have to have a functioning digestive system. You have to have a functioning nervous system. You have to have a functioning endocrine system. And if you look at various diseases, you'll almost always see that they're described in terms of the impact they have on a particular system or as a malfunction of a particular system. So that's another general theme and why we want to have a general understanding of each of these. Okay, lymphatic and immune systems, these are two that we'll look at in detail along with digestion when we're together next week. So this is defense against infection. The lymphatic system helps in immunity, but also helps to maintain fluid balance. So, swelling, for example, inflammation. These are all consequences of responses in the immune system, in the lymphatic system. So this is a way of fighting disease and controlling where those battles happen and what cells are involved and what strategies are being used, the body's response to essentially outside pathogens is really what's happening with the lymphatic and immune system. So we'll see that in a lot of detail a little bit later on. And reproduction, of course, without reproduction, species can't maintain, and human reproduction is complex and wonderful. And the idea behind sexual reproduction, we often, of course, think in terms of sexual intercourse, but sexual reproduction, again, on the biological level, is just reproduction that involves sperm and egg, or two strains in the case of fungi, for example. Animals reproduce sexually. There are a couple exceptions, but they're so strange that they're regarded as being, just completely out of the ordinary. The union of sperm and egg in humans, of course, happens internally inside the woman's body. Fertilization takes place in the fallopian tubes. The developing embryo then implants into the uterus, and the baby develops internally. And live birth is the strategy we use. In the case of most reptiles, you have eggs, and eggs are used as a way to protect a developing embryo external to the body. In some reproduction of animals, you have a simple union of sperm and egg in the water, and the developing embryo drifts about and just hopes for the best. There are lots of different strategies in animals, but sexual reproduction is the general strategy, using or by way of gametes, sperm and egg. And we know about the formation of those sex cells from our study of meiosis. And, the various structures that are involved in human reproduction are really fascinating. And it's actually a really interesting topic to teach and explore because sex is treated so improperly, for lack of a better word, in our culture sometimes. And any frank or honest or biological discussion of sex is often, made uncomfortable because people don't want to sort of separate from the cultural treatment of sexual behavior. But really, really fascinating and wonderful collection of organs and strategies used to ensure that that we make more people. And it's a really wonderful part of our human experience. So that's all the time we have for it, unfortunately, there. But that basic strategy is one that we have seen in other organisms, but not looked at in much detail for humans. Okay, so that's our overview. Whew, thanks for your patience with this. I know that video lectures, I do them in one take, so they're so far from perfect, and we don't have the opportunity to ask questions and interact. But I hope that it helps to supplement what's available in the text and provide the opportunity for you to get just the basics of what I think is pretty accessible information, pretty logical and understandable information, but also hugely important as you move forward in your various fields of study. So I hope that you got a little bit out of this anyway. And again, as always, reach out with any questions or concerns, and we'll be in touch soon. Bye bye.